Welcome back to another episode of The Robin Zander Show. I am so excited for today's interview with two guests. Anthony Kim, the founder and CEO of Education Elements, and former guest on the podcast and speaker at Responsive Conference, Alexis Gonzales-Black. And we are here today to talk about their new book, The New School Rules, 6 Vital Practices for Thriving and Responsive Schools. I had a blast conducting this interview and sitting down with them, and I hope you enjoy this interview as much as I did. And we are live.
Yay.
Anthony, Alexis, thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us.
This is such a pleasure. I was thrilled when I had heard that you were publishing a book together. And maybe as a place to start, if you two want to talk about how you first came into contact. You referred to it at the beginning of your book, which obviously we'll go into.
Yes.
But your collaboration is really interesting to me. So how did you come into contact?
Yeah.
Do you want to tell your version of the story first?
See if they match up.
Yeah.
I was had just moved to the Bay Area, and I had met somebody named Adam Pizzoni. Adam is who introduced us, I think. And Adam had just spoken at a conference that you guys had put on. And I was looking for people who were interested in the sort of future of work and people who were interested in holacracy. And he introduced me to Anthony. And then I ended up leading a implementation of holacracy at Education Elements.
Yep, that's pretty accurate.
That's it.
Yep.
Okay.
I hear my dog, so she might be wandering around in any minute.
For sure. Totally.
So we started, actually the first book that I read was a book called Team of Teams that you're familiar with by
Chris
Stanley
Fussell and
McChrystal.
Stan McChrystal's work.
Exactly. And that really inspired me to explore this a little bit further. And the main issue that we were trying to deal with is just these meetings that we had internally with 10, 15 people where we were getting through one or two things. And
how long were those meetings taking?
Like, an hour, right?
Okay.
A traditional hour-long meeting.
So let's actually back up and give some framing. You're the CEO and founder of Education Elements.
Correct, yeah.
How many people work at the company now?
About 50 people. We have offices in San Francisco and DC, and basically we're a management consulting company for school districts.
Okay, cool. But also with some technology implementation within school districts. So consulting and implementation.
Right.
Sort of new tech.
Yeah, and we probably work with 500 schools across the country. Yeah.
And so you had 10 or 15 people in these meetings, and they were taking a long time.
Yeah, our internal meetings and our client meetings were taking extremely long.
Okay.
But one of the things I noticed is our client meetings were better than our internal meetings. And what I noticed was because we were facilitating those external meetings, those meetings went well, and our internal meetings weren't facilitated.
Oh, interesting.
And so I started thinking about some of the things that I read in Team of Teams, and then I came across the holacracy concept. And it through my kind of discussions with Adam Pizzoni, who you know as well, we started talking about holacracy, and then I started looking at the responsive org stuff that you guys produced, and I hadn't met you at the time, and I was searching for a consultant, and Adam recommended Alexis.
Okay. And Alexis, in our first podcast interview, you defined holacracy, but maybe you could now, when you think of holacracy, or when we describe this concept in broad strokes, what is it?
I think the simplest definition is it's a self-management practice. So it is a system of rules and protocols and policies that help structure an organization so that it can be self-managed.
It's fun, actually. I've thought about this a lot, but I just heard a new word, which is practice. The idea of it's not a system that you implement and then it's done.
Yes.
And then that's how it operates going forward. But for holacracy or Team of Teams or anything else, and obviously what we're going to be talking about in the book, these self-managed processes or these new ways of working are processes and practices that take doing over time.
Absolutely. I mean, the kind of work that we do, I think for some time early in my consulting career, I thought that it was a matter of just like proffering the right solution and throwing it over the fence and saying, look, I designed this amazing thing for you.
Here's the framework, implement it, now you're done.
Everybody, you have that one moment in that one workshop where everybody's like, this is amazing. And then you walk away from it and you're like, I did it, check, it's done. But I think over the past 7 years of doing this kind of work, it's become abundantly clear that the kickoff meeting is just the first step in years and years of practice of getting self-management right. I think that's true. Yeah.
And what were some of the principles of Holacracy that you brought to Education Elements?
I think the foundational principles are about distributed versus delegated authority. So instead of just delegating tasks or projects, actually distributing that authority to people in the organization so that they have the ability to make decisions and to drive work and to steer the organization. I think, and we sort of clarify this and build on this in the book, but the idea of defaulting yes and defending no. Of sort of being willing to take on risks and to try new things as long as they fit within the scope of your purpose, and having to actually defend the naysaying and defend the objections with more rigor. And I think there are probably a lot of things, but those are some of the central pillars.
Anthony, as you started to explore some of the principles of Holacracy within the company, what took well? Like what went well for you with Alexis's help?
The first thing was just putting routines into a meeting. So like just a simple thing as a check-in or a checkout in the meetings really helped engage all of the participants.
Can you describe what a check-in and check-out is for the audience, for folks listening and watching?
Yeah, so usually, you come into a meeting, typically what happens is there's an agenda, someone drives the meeting and starts yapping at the agenda, right? And no one talks.
Right.
So the check-in is going around to each person in the room and saying, like, how are you feeling? Are you present? What's going on? And the checkout is more of a reflection, like an exit ticket in the classroom, saying, okay, like we had this meeting. How do you feel? Like, do you know exactly what you're going to do? Do I need to follow up with you?
Nice.
And so it does two things. One, it gets everybody talking right away. It gives me a lot of information as kind of the facilitator around how people are feeling and what I might expect from like the way people respond.
Yeah.
And then finally, like I think people feel like they all participated in the meeting.
Cool.
Yeah. That's something I noticed about facilitating Anthony's team's meetings early on was these check-ins were a moment for people to close their laptops to sort of disengage from what they were doing and get present. And people would just like look up and be like, oh God, I don't even know why I'm here, or I don't have anything to say.
Yeah.
And just like getting that out at the beginning of the meeting rather than sort of sitting on that and just, lingering with that the whole time and then feeling like you've wasted an entire hour.
Yeah.
It's such a flip and it's so small, but it feels like it's such a great change.
What did you see when you went into Education Elements? What was going well and what were the areas that were lacking?
Well, he has a great team of super dynamic individuals. They were all really open to changing and just open to exploring new topics. I felt like that was great. I don't know. What did I notice? I guess, your team better, but I think there's a lot of like desire for clarity. Who's making decisions? Who gets to make this decision? Why are we all sitting together for hours and hours every week? What can we get out of this time? I don't think that's different than any other organization that I've worked with, but just like they have a big task on their shoulder. They're driving this organization that's working with hundreds of thousands of teachers, and everybody has a lot of stuff to do. And if you're going to bring people together for several hours a week, it's like we want to know exactly what we're doing here.
Time is precious in that context. Yeah.
And I think I felt that immediately.
Yeah, I think also one of the things, it's always every organization, whether it's us or the school districts that we work with, the tension between tight and loose is really hard to balance. And I think that's what we experienced as well. It's like, well, people want clarity and procedures and all of this stuff and know that they're doing it right.
But also autonomy and freedom to experiment.
Yeah, exactly. And schools feel the same thing. And so just trying to figure out like how to make that not one thing or the other. It's like this dynamic stew that
I've been thinking about that a lot just within my own small experiment of the cafe. So we have 12, 13 employees now. And it's not Starbucks, right?
Yeah.
We don't make every single shot of espresso exactly the same way. People have different styles. I look at Starbucks or Peet's Coffee and like you get the same amount of chocolate in your mocha every single time because there's a machine that measures it out. And so in a context like that, that's very industrial, you lose some of the personal, but there's handbooks for everything. There's
Yeah.
an answer to everything.
Yeah.
There's a phone number to call for everything.
Yeah.
And so how to balance that
Yeah.
tension in any organization where you give humans the freedom, but also they have a sense of security and know what to rely on.
Yeah, one thing you should know about Anthony is that it was pretty great to see even him on this journey, because I think most people, when they think about Tony at Zappos or other holacratic leaders, they think that there's this like everybody needs authority, you know, everybody drive everything, and like this is how we're going to innovate. But there's actually, and you know, this desire to want to accomplish a specific goal and a specific purpose, and a need to sort of have boundaries and bumpers on that so that people are moving in the same direction. And so I think a lot of people's immediate thought about leaders like this are that they're just like, they want complete chaos and people running around and just having total freedom. And I could say that that's like even a personal tension that I think both I and Anthony struggle with, is you want freedom, but you also need a balance to that.
Right.
And you need people moving in the same direction, because you have a job to accomplish and a mission
Right.
and a purpose. And that is constantly in flux. So, I mean, I think it's just like important to point out that it's not the sort of chaos that everybody imagines when they think about distributed or self-managing systems.
Yeah. So, Anthony, you brought Alexis in to help implement not Holacracy fully, but little aspects of it. And specifically, one of the problems to solve was these meetings that were lasting forever and not getting enough done. How did that then turn into the book, The New School Rules?
Yeah. So what we did was one of the policies that we have is anything we're going to deploy out at a school that we work with, we're going to actually experience ourselves. And so we took some of the practices that Alexis introduced us to and started testing the waters with these things at the schools.
Okay.
And schools run into the same problems. Like they'll have 15 people in a meeting, all like senior level leaders in a school district, trying to figure out like what kind of English language arts textbook adoption they're going to do. And it could take them 6 months
Right.
to figure this out, because they're hearing everyone's opinions. And one of the things that we really appreciated about the work we did with Alexis was being really clear on known things, assumptions that you're making, and things that are anticipated, right?
Yeah.
What's an example of that?
An example of that would be in some of the districts that we work with, they'll say, well, if we implement X, Y, and Z, these teachers won't participate in the professional development that we're doing.
Okay.
It's like, okay, is that a known fact? Is that, based on patterns, or are you just hypothesizing? Is that do you even have valid information?
Completely.
And usually, like, the person that brings up this idea for better PD systems is sitting there trying to defend all of these naysayers as to why it's still a good idea. And I think what she taught us was to switch the role around a little bit and say, if you're the naysayer, you have to provide some evidence as to why you're saying that this is a bad idea.
Yeah.
Jumping around a little bit, but I want to touch, Alexis, on your history with education and how
Yeah.
you found your way back to writing a book in this space.
Yes. So I started my career as a high school teacher, and I remember walking into the classroom on the first day and meeting with some of the veteran teachers. And one of the veteran teachers, who was the head of our PLC, our professional learning community, as I walked in the room, she flipped all of her materials face down on her desk and said, "You're going to have to learn to make your own materials."
So
And
cool.
I thought, like, that is such a weird introduction to teaching and to education. I thought that we were going to be collaborative, but obviously there's something in the system here that's incentivizing this person to actually hide their work from me, right? And not share their work.
Oh, interesting. So it wasn't an invitation for you to create for yourself. It was a protectiveness.
It was a yes, it was a
Interesting.
protectiveness.
Okay.
And as a brand new teacher, I was like, I mean, yeah, it gave me a lot of creative latitude, but also the idea that I couldn't learn from what somebody else was doing, it was tough. And I saw that happen over and over again, where it seemed like teachers were putting in so much effort, and were just basically like in silos. They were competing with each other. When I left education years later, I became a recruiter for teachers, and I thought maybe this is how we'll get at the problem. We'll recruit super dynamic teachers. And then I saw those teachers leaving in droves and getting burnt out.
Right. What's the statistic in the book? More than 20% attrition.
Yes. I mean,
of
it is.
teachers in the United States today.
Yeah, on an annual basis, right? So
Annually,
yeah,
more
every
than 20%
year.
of teachers leave.
Yeah, there's a district, one of the largest districts in the country that we work with in Florida. Every year they're recruiting 30% new
Wow.
teachers from both natural
Yeah.
attrition from retirement to
Yeah.
people just moving on
Burning
to,
out.
or moving on to different jobs and such.
Yeah.
And so it's, a lot of districts are focused on like a recruiting problem, but it's also like this retention problem
Right.
that they need to address.
Yeah.
So this
yeah.
is fun, and I'll probably keep finding examples of it, but that is exactly a problem that organizations in every different industry today are struggling with, right?
Yeah.
But I think that there's this disconnect where, of course, the Microsofts and the GEs and the Silicon Valley startups of the world are struggling with recruitment and retention, but school districts are struggling with the same problems, and they are as severe, if not more severe, in that arena.
Yeah. I mean, especially when you look at the great impact that having a teacher in a school year over year has, right? Like you
Right.
get to know the kids, you get really embedded in the community, you can have outsized impact the longer that you're in a place. And for the average tenure of a teacher to be 2 to 3 years is just not enough
Right.
to get the impact that we want with our kids. So, I mean, I kept running into these issues. I ran for the school board. I helped craft policy for the state of Nevada, and it was no different there too. You see all of these well-intentioned individuals showing up and pouring energy into the system to try and overhaul it, but it's
Right.
like turning the Titanic around. I mean, it's just like so much effort for such little change. And so I think when Anthony first pitched the idea of maybe we could apply some of these principles to education, I was game from day one. I thought, this is a new way to look at an age-old problem we're having.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are some of the other problems that you both have seen so prevalent in education today? And how does that impact, at the end of the day, the students?
Yeah. I mean, Anthony's embedded in the districts every day. So maybe, I don't know, there's something come top of mind for you.
Yeah. So there's a couple things that are just routine in a school district, right? Like every district has to create a strategic plan, for example. It turns out these strategic plans come out every 3 to 5 years, or every time a superintendent changes,
Okay.
which is also every 3.5 years, right?
Okay.
So,
And the strategic plan lays out.
yeah, it's like the business plan for a district, right?
Okay, cool.
And everyone feels like their strategic plan is so different than everybody else's strategic plan, but they're actually quite similar. Like every district cares about better student outcomes, more effective quality teachers, engaged community, students ready for college and career. Like those are the elements of
Right.
every strategic plan, but everyone verbalizes it slightly different, but they'll
Right.
spend 2 years putting it together.
And this is a many 100-page.
Yeah,
thorough,
exactly.
I mean, I'm thinking of business plans
Yeah.
that I created. Like,
Yeah.
just
A short
endless
one is
work.
20 pages, right?
Okay. Yeah.
But it's like months and years of work. And what we found is the end product is still the same, which is this document that people like hold with all these metrics.
right.
And by the time they're done with it, they have no time to execute because the people that were part of it are no longer there. The technology that they mention in it is no longer existent.
Why do you roll your eyes there, Alexis?
I mean, I've seen when I was on the school board, these plans, and by the time you're even reading the plan on the school board, you're already 3 years behind.
Right. You're starting
You're
from...
starting, and by the time it lands on your desk, you're already outdated. The people who you thought were going to implement this plan are long gone. They're in
Right.
different careers. They're someplace else. And it feels like you're always racing from behind. And in the book, we have this story where a district that we were working with was sending out its 7-year teacher it's 5-year teacher recognition on the 7th anniversary of,
Okay.
yes. So basically people would get recognized for 5 years of service.
Right.
After
2
they'd been
years.
working there for 7 years.
Okay. And how many of those teachers had then either retired or left?
I mean, it's like a meaningful gesture that had been reduced to a joke because of the inability for the district to get on top of
Right.
this and make some decisions about aligning
and
things
the
more
point-
quickly. Yeah.
Too, that I want to make, or that I see, is it's not about, okay, school districts just need to work harder or like put in more work or put in more hours,
No.
right? So that inefficiency of celebrating 5 years anniversary on the 7th year anniversary isn't as a result either of delinquency, especially, or incompetency or not enough hard work. It's the system that is creating these processes.
Yes.
The system of the school district itself.
That's exactly right. And I think that's why we wrote the book, is because there are people who are working incredibly hard for our kids, but because the organization they're in and the challenges that they're faced with, they aren't able to get a return on that time and a return on that investment. And I think Anthony often uses this example of swimming. And I don't know if you want to share your story, because I think it's an apt metaphor for what's happening in school districts.
Yeah, sure. So usually when I'm meeting with district leaders and they're talking about their work, and I think it resonates with most of the district leaders, everybody is working incredibly long hours, dealing with snow days, issues in the community, all this stuff. And it's not that we're not putting the effort in, it's just how we're putting the effort. So I give this analogy or metaphor around, when I learned to swim 4 years ago, I would, wail my arms and legs, and I couldn't get across the pool because I was totally exhausted by the time I got halfway through.
Totally.
And my swim coach basically showed me that if I streamlined my body, I would be able to use 1/10 the effort to get across the pool, and now I could swim laps.
Yeah.
And so that kind of led me to believe, and especially with our work at Elements also, is everyone's working incredibly hard as individuals, but no one's ever been trained to work in teams. And so what I talk about is the shape of the vessel being the team. The people are the engine, like the cylinders in the engine.
Totally.
But when the vessel isn't streamlined, then we put a lot of effort and not get to our goals. And I think that's the truth in a lot of the schools that we work with. Other analogy I would use is in sports. What we find is, a coach comes up with a play. That may take a day or so to come up with a play, but the teams actually practice those plays over and over again to anticipate where all of the team members are,
right?
So that they don't even have to think about where they're going to be.
So in the moment, it's effortless.
So in the game, in real time, like it happens in seconds, but you already know where everybody's going to be, right? And there's still like dynamics that happen with the other teams that are involved.
And so maybe at Elements and then in a school district, what does it look like for those rehearsals and then for implementation when it really matters? Like, how did you do that first internally and then within school districts?
Well, so just going back to our meeting, we started with a modified version of Holacracy that Alexis helped us with. And then those became our plays, right? Every meeting is conducted with a facilitator, there's a secretary, there's a protocol that we use for every meeting. And so those are the plays.
Yep.
And then every meeting that we operate after that is the practice, right? We practice learning how to function with each other on a regular basis. Yeah. And then when we go out to the clients, like these guys, our guys are now fluent in how to get people engaged in the meeting. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I hadn't heard that before. That's good, Anthony.
I'm super intrigued by teams, and you reference the Team of Teams, Stan McChrystal's book. But also you talk about interviewing somebody who was an infantryman on the ground in the midst of the Iraq War, and some of his experiences in these changes that they were trying to make, keeping up with an enemy, with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, that was using technology to communicate much more rapidly than the U.S. military was able to. And this fellow, just the simple things that he carried, his daily gear, he was given more authority over, more autonomy to control. Can you describe that story?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was talking to Devin, who was a Marine, and he was stationed in Afghanistan. So after I read the book, I called him up. I knew him, and just started asking him like how McChrystal's kind of systems and standard operating procedures impacted his day-to-day work. And basically, they were given something simple as like, how do I pack my rucksack for the job I'm doing? And that mattered a lot to them because, the way he was explaining it is if I go on patrol and I know I'm going to hit a lot of enemy territory, I want to carry more ammunition, right? And I don't need to carry my sleeping bag. I'm not going out and, camping with these guys. So the ability to make some decisions on the ground really helped. And it's not somebody that is so far removed from the day-to-day action. So we were able to take this notion of standard operating procedures and then give some guidance and like data feedback at the base level, and then he was able to like actually make decisions on what he carries and be accountable for it in some ways, because he can't blame anybody at this point. But just going back to your coffee idea, you know, we're pretty close with the former president of Starbucks who sits on our board, and we talked about this as well. Like, although a barista has a recipe for, you know, a latte, right? X number of shots, how hot the milk is, how close to the rim it goes, the foam goes. They're also given a lot of autonomy around making a completely custom mix for the random person that walks in with,
Sure.
you know, 20 different, you know, options on it, right? So they're given some standards, but they're given some autonomy to make tweaks to that. Otherwise, we would never have the Frappuccino. Because they didn't invent that out of HQ. They invented it because somebody wanted a latte that was blended in with ice. And so it's similar, and it ties back into the classroom, because districts and central offices are providing things like pacing guides to classrooms, and everybody struggles to follow the pacing guide, but no one's really telling people to follow the pacing guide. Like, we actually want that to be kind of the standard operating procedure where you're making decisions, but that's not happening in many places today.
I really like in the book how you describe the lean startup methodology, the agile, these different things that are, you know, even the business plan, which in Silicon Valley, for you know, where we are right now, are sort of common parlance, common vocabulary, and then create your own definition of what is a responsive school district, and structure the entirety of the book around an action plan to build a more responsive school.
Yeah.
So can you maybe speak to, you know, what is the lean startup, and then how have you translated that into what is responsiveness within a school district?
Yeah, well, I think that one thing that we've noticed about being in Silicon Valley and being surrounded by these buzzwords of lean or holacracy or responsive is that it's hard. It's easy to talk about these conversations up here, where like we're talking about principles or ideas, or like
Very
people should
high
have
level.
at a very high level. But how do you actually ground that in the daily practice and the daily rituals and choices that people are making? And I think that is something that I've always craved, being in these discussions. And so that's what we tried to translate into the book. There are 15 different experiments. They come with sort of instructions and artifacts. You can see what it might look like and actually try out these new ways of operating. And we encourage people to tailor them. So, you know, part of that sort of lean approach is sort of launching a minimum viable experiment and then iterating, right? Seeing what works in your context, what doesn't work in your context. And so we give sort of a framework for that so that people can really tailor these things to what works in their own daily life and in their own teams. And I think that's part of the feedback that we've heard about the book that people really appreciate about it, is that it's so actionable. And I don't know that there are a lot of, at least I haven't read a lot of stuff on these topics of responsive and agile that feel so practical and so grounded.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's back to where we started. It's not a framework. It's not a X, Y, and Z. If you apply it, it will work. It's, here are some tests to try. Go try them and see what happens. Here are some things it's safe enough to try. Go experiment. Go play.
Absolutely. I think actually people will learn how to use this responsive operating system by trying it. Like we talked about at the very opening of this podcast, it's a practice, right? And when you think of a practice, it's not something that you get certified in and then you're just done doing it for the rest of your life. It is a daily practice of saying, is this still working? Is this still serving us? Is this serving our purpose? Should we tweak it? And I think embracing that journey is part of becoming a responsive school district.
Well, just kind of going back to Alexis's story around like the teacher that onboarded her, right, and saying like you got to figure out your own, you know, lesson plans or whatever
You may
it
not
is.
use my materials.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I think that goes into a different age, right? When we were in the information age, holding information was really valuable, and that's how you held value, by not sharing it with everybody. And there's still that generation is actively working, and you probably encountered that. Whereas like the newer generations are like, no, it's about like moving beyond that, right? It's about sharing that information and being connected.
Well, it wouldn't even work. If that happened
Yeah.
today, I mean,
Yeah.
this was like 10 years
Yeah.
ago, but if that happened today, I would just Google
Yeah,
lesson plans,
right.
biology lesson
Right.
Yeah.
plans, and I would have access to a number
Right.
of resources. So it's not the way the world functions today. And yet we still have, people who are holding on and hoarding information because it feels like the last vestige of power, of like what people can access and what they can control. Even though that's not how the world operates around us. So
Yeah, that's right.
What are some of the experiments that you've seen school districts trying out since you started working together, maybe even since the publication of the book? But what are some experiments that schools have been successfully or unsuccessfully trying?
The book features 6 different case studies where Anthony and his team have actually observed people implementing some of these things and trying them. And there's one case study, and it comes in the sort of information chapter about sort of being more transparent and letting information flow, where he actually puts up communications on like billboards in the town that they're serving. And so he's having he's having town hall meetings, but he's also like sending advertisements to the movie theaters, or he's putting up billboards around town, which is just so unheard of. If you think about
totally. But at the same time, the community wants to know what's going on, right? If I have kids in the local school district, I want to know what's going on, and I might not be going to the PTA meetings or to the school board meetings.
Absolutely.
But to be able to share that and disseminate that information with the broad community is brilliant.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, something to think about is like many of the districts that we've worked with, they're probably one of the top 5 employers in whatever community they work in, right?
Wow. In terms of sheer number of employees.
Yeah, exactly. It's not so true here in Silicon Valley.
Sure.
But if you're anywhere else in like the middle of the country, whether you're a district with 500 kids or a district with 50,000 kids, there's a good chance you're going to be the largest employer.
Pause there for something that's like just strikes me. We're talking about organizations that employ more people than any other organization in the country on the whole, that range in size between 500, maybe even less than that, upwards of 50,000. Like
there are districts that have 500,000, a million
scale,
kids. Yeah.
and the challenges associated.
Yeah.
Right. And yet these are also simultaneously some of the, like, it's easy in, here in Silicon Valley looking at the Bay Bridge, but like we're talking about lean methodology and agile and like still struggling to find words to describe these complex concepts. And like no wonder in a lot of ways that school districts are struggling and need more tools to figure out how to adapt, how to keep pace with change.
Yeah, I was thinking about this the other day because somebody was talking about how far the medical industry has come. So if you look at like what a doctor's office looked like in the early 1900s, I don't know, maybe they were putting like leeches on you or something. I don't know what was happening. I'm not an authority on this, but you go into the Palo Alto medical facility now, and it is completely revolutionized, not just by technology, but by the way that people are working and the way that people are organizing.
Totally.
But you look at the school system of the early 1900s, the schoolhouse, you have one teacher in the front of the room, you have kids at desks,
It looks very, very similar.
And
to
it
how
weirdly
did 100
looks
years ago.
Exactly. It looks similar. So I think that's, part of this idea of like change has come, but it hasn't reached the places that really need it. And there are many, many innovative things happening in school districts, but again, just the vessel, the structure of the districts looks
the same. Yeah.
Eerily similar.
The other point that you make in the book, and that when I've interviewed Adam Pisoni on the podcast, he's raised as well, is schools, especially schools of the early 1900s, were designed to create professionals to work in factories or to work in very large organizations doing rote tasks repetitively. And we look at the structure of schools today. There are alarms that tell you when to go from one class to the next. There's a school schedule that you go to the same class at the same time every single day. It's not optimized for creative problem solving or emotional intelligence. It's optimized to create automata to do specific tasks.
Yeah. Absolutely. I see this even being a parent of a child now, where I want to say like, just do it. And then I have this thought where I'm like, am I preparing her for the complex world where she's going to have to think critically and like make decisions on her own and be self-determining? So, I think, when we look at school systems and we look at the world around us, like where the future of our economy is and the future of jobs are, it's requiring this incredible critical thinking muscle, these incredible incredible sort of self-management muscles that we are leaving our children very poorly equipped with when they graduate from school. And so I think if our education organizations could embrace some of these concepts and model that for students, right? Model what it looks like to not wait for a memo to come down from the district office to tell you exactly how to pace your lessons for the year, but instead driving that yourself and innovating and being an innovator in your space. I think it would be an incredibly powerful message for our kids. I think it's really important.
What's another case study? So you talked about transparency. What other experiments have you seen? Maybe you, Anthony, you're closest to the ground of the schools. Are you seeing people try?
So I guess first I just wanted to explain the structure of the book, right? So there's 6 practices, which are kind of the cornerstones of the systems you have to put in place. There's 15 experiments across those 6 practices, and Alexis and I crafted these experiments from kind of like easy to intermediate, let's say. Right. So there are things that you could try. The way we describe it in the book is there are things you could try immediately on your own. So I could start my next meeting with a check-in, and that's something I could do without like getting everybody on board. But there are also things that are kind of more like molecules, right? Like I need other people to participate in order for it to work. And so those are more intermediate. So like a governance structure that Holacracy mentions, like, if you're going to deny somebody opportunity to try something, like there's a structure that you have to go through. That's something that everyone has to buy into, right? Or roles and accountabilities don't have to be assigned to a title, right? Those kinds of things, a lot of people have to buy into, right? So there's that. And then on the website, which, the newschoolrules.com website, we've developed a series of workouts, what we call workouts. So there's these experiments, and then the workouts are like the building that muscle that we talk about. And recently I did a workshop for a district where we just focused on planning for change. And it was a simple exercise of, basically pick a goal that you have, whether it's in teams or by the school or individually, and list out all of the things that you think you have to do or consider.
Can you give an example?
Maybe like one district, they were, planning a chili cook-off, something as simple as a chili cook-off.
Awesome.
And it was a school team, right? And they were worried about how many people might attend, how much money they're going to raise if someone was going to deliver a particular product, some chili or whatever. There were a lot of things that they worried about. And as the meeting went along, more and more worries kind of built on top. And so they couldn't make any decisions. So just the simple act of having them kind of break it down into 3 columns, like I said, there's some things you absolutely know, the date, right? Who's going to contribute to certain things, like
you're feeding people chili.
Yeah, exactly. Let's make some decisions that like we can control today.
Cool.
Right. And so that's one
Let's
column.
Call the venue and schedule the date.
Right.
Yes.
The other column is like we have some like qualitative and quantitative data, but it's collective, right? So it could be, we think, or the weather, or whatever it is, like, or it's these people might not show up, right? Because they consistently don't show up, or they say they always promise something, but they never deliver.
Sure.
So that's part of the collective knowledge that gets created. And those are the second things that they could work on. But then there's always people that are like, well, I don't like, well, this color is going to offend this group of people. And so those, some of these types of things hold up decision-making because there are a lot of assumptions and not a lot of evidence to back up those assumptions. And so just by having them organize the information that way, help them make like 4 decisions right away, right? That they wouldn't have made before.
Sure, totally.
Kind of temper some of the concerns people had, because after 3 more meetings, they may not be the same concerns.
Right.
And then the ones that they need to collect more data on, they knew they had to go collect more data instead of just kind of talking about it.
Yeah. I love that. Decide there are things that we can do today. And I think in any meeting I've ever been in where people are sort of caught up here with all of the what ifs and this might happen, and then they leave the meeting having made no decisions, there's this sense of hopelessness of like, we're never going to get closer to this. We're going to have to push the chili cook-off back or whatever's happening.
But as soon as you have some things that force action, if you have a date, then we're just counting down. Okay, we have 45 days until the chili cook-off, so let's figure out what needs to get done in order to make it happen.
And there are always things that you can do today with the information that you have.
Yeah.
And so once you get a couple of those under your belt too, there's sort of this inertia effect of like, okay, wow, we like moved those things off of our plate. Next meeting we can tackle those things. And it begins to move and feel a lot more liberating that you're getting things done.
Well, I think as individuals, we normally have this tendency like to wait till the last minute, and all of a sudden you're wondering how I got all of this stuff done. And that's just because there's more clarity as you get closer to the deadline, right? And oftentimes we'll blow a lot of the energy in planning all these hypotheticals and think that that's preparation. But really it's like we had a lot of clarity at a certain point, and so we were able to execute on those things.
Yeah.
And so I think one way teams can not exhaust themselves is if they didn't waste a lot of energy on this extra work around planning that goes into it, because we are like teams across the country are exhausting themselves trying to anticipate every future move when we can't predict most of the future.
Create a business plan today for 2020.
Right.
Like it just doesn't work because who knows what the world is going to be doing.
Right.
Right. And designing a school in the same way for 2020 today and 2018, early 2018 it's equally impractical.
Right.
For folks listening, let's just say there's parents listening, there's educators listening. What are a couple of concrete tactics that you would have them take away and start implementing now? If I'm a parent and my kids are in a school district, if I'm an educator and I'm working with a child, I'm working with a group of children, what can I do now? How do I make change?
Yeah, I think as an educator, there's a lot that you can get started with. And I think when we do this presentation, and we've been on sort of this tour and talking to people across the country, there's this worry that my principal's not going to like this, or my district has some very strict policies about the way that we go about, interacting with parents or whatever it is. But you have to understand what is within your realm of control. And what you can do is you can work in different ways that then demand that other people interact with you in different ways. And so, for example, trying a mini experiment. So if you have, in the book, we talk about changing parent-teacher conferences to where the student is actually leading the parent-teacher conference. Which is like, instead of just showing up and like dreading like, oh my gosh, the teacher's going to tell my mom about how bad but you're actually empowering the student in that case to lead a discussion about what's been going well for them, what's been challenging for them.
And talk about a growth mindset opportunity for the child, for the kid, whatever age.
Yes.
My 5-year-old nephew all the way to, a senior in high school or even beyond, but to be the person taking responsibility for how that conversation goes.
Yeah.
And they might actually be more nervous at the start of that. But over time, the practice of facilitation and facilitating you, the teacher, and you, the parent, and like we three are going to have a dialogue rather than you two are going to have a dialogue about me.
About me. And I'm sitting here as sort of a passive subject, just listening to people.
Creates learned helplessness.
It does. And, and I think some of the feedback or the fears that you hear are like, well, what if the right thing isn't said? Or what if there's a sensitive topic that we don't want the kid isn't mature enough to deal with? Well, I mean, save 10 minutes at the end for the student to leave, say thank you for leading that, and have a one-on-one with the parent. It's, it's this idea that if you have an idea or an experiment, try and find a small place to launch that. And if there are concerns, fix them next time, iterate, change it, add 10 minutes in at the end where you can talk to the parent. But don't let the sort of anticipated fears or the worries of what might happen or could happen get in the way.
Have always been done.
get in the way of trying something a little bit new. And I think one of the quotes from the book that has always stuck with me is somebody who said, I no longer feel like a victim to changing priorities. I feel like I can drive change from where I am. And that, I mean, I think that's what revitalizes our school systems, is when the people within them can actually pick up a piece of data, pick up a reflection, a parent, piece of feedback, and actually change a little bit the way that they approach something and have the power and authority to do that. And I think that's when school districts really come to life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess what I would add to that is one of the things that we're going to struggle with is people being interested in the teaching practice, right? In the profession of teaching.
The pedagogy.
Yeah, and also it's a very tough work environment, right? Yeah. You have to show up at a certain time. You can't go to the bathroom when you want, right? There's bells that, like you said, telling you when to do stuff, and things are constantly getting piled on you. And I can't go over to the Starbucks and get a coffee in the middle of the day,
right.
Where most companies now, you can do things like that. You have a lot of flexibility.
Right, you're not locked in a room for
exactly.
set periods of time.
So I think the hard question for school systems will be, how do we create work conditions for a profession that most people don't want to work in those types of environments.
Yep.
And creating better functioning teams because people go into education because of purpose.
You want to serve students.
Right.
I mean...
Yeah, you feel like you're making a contribution to society because you're helping educate the future.
Right.
So one of the things that is really important, and if you look at any of the Google studies around workforce, is it's not about like hiring a perfect engineer. It's not hiring a STEM-focused person. Actually, it's not even hiring the best candidates. It's like hiring the best people that can work in teams is the number one thing that makes an organization grow and evolve.
Collaboration.
Right. And so while schools are education organizations, they're not learning systems. And they're not learning systems because they're in a pyramid structure, right? Because information only flows in one direction. And so I think the practices that we're talking about, and what responsive organizations also talks about, is how do you create that kind of organic structure that allows information to flow, that allows other people to get the information and data that they need to make decisions, so that it's not reliant on things. And the speed of change is so fast, we can't function in that model anymore. But the characteristics of the people that we're trying to educate if we want students to be to work in teams well, we're not creating the structures in the system that allow them to work in teams if you're sitting in rows.
Sure, completely. Yeah.
I just want to say one quick thing about the teaching profession that sparked as you were talking. It's not just not having like Pete's coffee or whatever, or not having breaks. That's all hard, right? Those are all kind of structures that make the job hard. But I think the hardest part about teaching is the actual job is really difficult. If you think about it, you've got 30 kids. Maybe if you're a high school teacher, you're seeing 120 kids or something on a daily basis who each have their own story, have their own sort of layers that you need to peel back before you can access what is driving them or what is motivating them. And I don't think there's any job in Silicon Valley or that I've even had as a consultant that is as difficult as trying to move 120 individual people with their own, struggles, or people who are, they didn't eat breakfast or they had a fight with somebody, trying to remove that to get them to learn about
teenagers and sleep deprived. I'm just imagining. Yeah.
Right. Or they're, living in poverty and they have real challenges that some of us haven't even experienced, but like trying to peel that back and teach somebody critical thinking skills or build awareness about global ecosystems with them. It is the hardest job I have ever had. And to try and do it with a limited tool set, and in these limited structures that sort of say, nope, not allowed to do that, not allowed to do that. Nope, you can't do that. It ups the stakes so incredibly. It makes it so much more difficult. And I think there are really brilliant people in education systems. And if we can sort of release some of that talent by loosening our systems a little bit and being more flexible, I think it would make the job a lot. I mean, I don't know that it'll ever get easier, but at least it'll make it a lot easier to sort of fulfill your purpose there. Yeah.
Take homes from the book, things that if you could see changes if you could wave a magic wand and see school districts implement these changes, what would that look like?
I love talking to teachers who are just like, I can I can try different things in my classroom. It's safe enough to try. And I know this has become like the bane of Anthony's existence recently, is like everybody at Elements is like, safe enough to try. It's safe enough to try. So we can get into that. But I love how sticky it is. Like you see teachers just beginning to use that language.
Yeah.
And
I've
you're
never
like, yes.
taught a team check-in rounds where they didn't say, oh my God, that was transformational. And it's such a simple thing of, how am I this morning before we go into our meeting? But it creates such a human connection and such a potency in a team.
Yes.
Yeah,
I think
there's a lot of simple practices like that.
That's the great stuff.
I have to hear now at Elements, safe enough to try. What's going on there?
I mean, it's interesting. We're actually doing a podcast, right? And I know a bunch of people in my network that are doing their own podcasts. And so someone in our office had the idea of doing a podcast too,
Sure.
5 years after everyone else has podcasts. And I was like, well, what information do we have about other people doing podcasts and how complicated it is? And,
Sure.
like, how do I know this is going to be like sustained over a period of time? And those were all unanswered questions, but like, it's safe enough to try in our organization, right? So it's like, okay, I have to trust that you did some research to figure this out. It's not even something that is my accountability as doing it in terms of marketing.
Sure.
But it is my accountability that like our company's resources are put towards the things that are going to drive
Completely.
growth. And that's what I'm thinking about. And maybe the person that's making that decision is different than, thinking about how resources are allocated within the organization.
Yeah, totally.
It's real. These are real. This is why it's a practice and not a solution.
Yeah. And that's why, that's the great thing about this. It's like a lifestyle, right? And it's a way of functioning. Just like, if you want to have a healthy lifestyle, like you work out your diet differently and you work out your exercise habits differently.
Completely.
And this to me is the same thing. Is I'm not looking for the perfect solution. It's not the Mediterranean diet that's going to solve all my problems, but it's really this way of thinking about problems that come up through work or life and being able to navigate that with a certain lens that helps you get to the goals that you want to achieve.
Yeah. Both individually and for the book and for your work together, where can people listening and watching go to learn more?
You can go to newschoolrules.com. There are a ton of resources there. There's a sample chapter there. There are the workouts that Anthony mentioned earlier, just a ton of resources. Also, connect with us on LinkedIn and reach out if you have any questions about the book. And of course, you can find the book on Amazon.com. And if you feel so inclined, we'd love it if you left a review.
Yeah, I've been offering to school districts that we work with, and even some that we don't work with, a chance to have a webinar. And so, if there's an organization that is able to get 10, 15 people together where it makes sense for us to do a webinar for them, we'd be happy to do a short, like 45-minute webinar. Yeah.
That's amazing. And then what about for you, Anthony, and for Ed Elements, and then for you, Alexis, and Thoughtful.org, where can people learn more about your separate works?
Of course, like the website, you can follow us on Twitter. Those are the normal things. But I think, there's a lot of schools that we work with across the country. If you wanted to talk to any of the schools about some of the changes that they're making, we're working with one district in Indianapolis where there's a new superintendent coming in, and he's like, I want my cabinet to work like the new school rules, right? Like I want this. I don't want to have assistant superintendents that only do elementary and other people that only do high school and only do assessments. I want to have like a well-informed, like sharing information, learning organization where people can go based on like their interests and expertise.
Cool.
So I see some of the districts that we're working with starting to think about like, is there a different org structure that they could develop for, to be much more nimble?
Alexis at Thoughtful.org is how you can reach out to me if
Perfect.
you're interested in learning more. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for writing the new school rules. Thank you for your work and for coming onto the podcast today.
Absolutely. Thank you,
Yeah.
Robin.
Thanks for adding us to your network.